Peterson has been accusing Sam Harris of committing the naturalistic fallacy. Now, the naturalistic fallacy can be taken to mean different things. On the one hand, it is often used by scientists coming from or researchers coming from the humanities. It is very often used against scientists who are dealing with only the right quadrants. And what they try to point out with this argument is that you can't deduce facts about consciousness from facts about matter or nature. Therefore, naturalistic fallacy. So you can't deduce from facts about nature facts about consciousness. And in general, this is true. And by nature, of course, I mean everything that can be just observed without interacting with it in a hermeneutic or dialogical fashion. From the very fact that a car runs 80 miles an hour, you can't really deduce whether it ought to run 80 miles an hour. So you can't deduce values, and you can't deduce facts about consciousness in general. From the very fact that a brain does something, you can't deduce immediately what kind of qualitative state the brain is actually in. By immediately, I mean without ever having talked to someone and without ever having interpreted someone's statements about what he feels like when he's in a specific brain state. So there is no immediate way into first-person facts from just seeing third-person facts. Now, this is the one way in which you can take the naturalistic fallacy, interpret the naturalistic fallacy, and how it's very often used. I see a lot of, for example, philosophers of education argue against the brain scientists who think they know what kind of incentive you have to take to do education right. So what we ought to do in education by just looking at brains. And what philosophers of education will try to point out is that this deduction is actually skipping the first-person perspective. It's not giving a rich, detailed account of the first-person perspective, and often ends up in very, very vague metaphors that are not applicable to the complexity of the human mind. Another kind of way in which you can interpret... let me stay with that. So I think that Peterson was accusing Sam Harris of exactly doing that. This is deducing first-person facts from third-person facts. Sam Harris never did that. Of course, he does correlation, but correlation is not to deduce first-person facts from third-person facts, but to correlate already pre-existing first-person facts, which we find out dialogically by using the hermeneutical methods, and to correlate these pre-existing first-person facts with third-person facts. So, in any case, Sam is not committing the naturalistic fallacy in this sense. Now, in the second sense, the naturalistic fallacy can mean that you simply cannot deduce an ought statement from an is statement. Again, you cannot deduce from a car is running 60 miles an hour. You cannot deduce the statement the car ought to run 60 miles an hour. Well, that's true if your is statement contains only third-person facts. This is facts about the right quadrants. But if, for example, your is statement contains facts about the lower left quadrant, like social reality, you can deduce ought statements. This is what Searle has shown. Searle has shown that within specific contexts, within specific social contexts, the social contexts themselves define the very meaning of the word ought. So if in the context of a soccer game you commit a rule violation, within that specific social context you ought to leave the field. And this is an immediate deduction of an ought statement from an is statement, where the is statement, of course, is embedded within a set of rules that define the meaning of the word ought. This is the one example, the one area where there is an exception to the rule, where you can legitimately deduce an ought statement from an is statement. And as Searle says in his article, you cannot, I think he said it, I'm not sure, you cannot get more ought than that. This is as ought as you can get. So it's not like he's using the word in a different way than it usually is being defined. This is a perfectly legitimate definition of the word ought in this specific context. This is how we use the word, it's not to abuse the word, some kind of different meaning. Now, people have been arguing, but wait a minute, what we want to have is something that is independent of context, independent of social context. We want to have some kind of absolute ought, what I ought to do in life. And the point is that the question is whether such an ought exists, whether you can have an ought which is independent of such social context. This was one example where if the facts that you're describing are about the lower left quadrant, you can deduce legitimately an ought statement from an is statement. But this is not to deduce a left quadrant fact from a right quadrant fact. Now, the other example that we could use is that if the if statement is a fact about individual consciousness itself, like for example, Sam uses this picture of the worst, how does he call it? The worst possible state you can be in, like the worst possible misery. Imagine a state in which you find yourself as a conscious creature, where there is no hope that things will get better, where things are just as bad as they can be, they couldn't be any worse. There is nothing to gain out of this painful experience. There is no way in which this could turn positive into something which you could then, where then you could then conclude, oh, it was good the way it was. The case of the worst possible misery to Sam is the definition of what is bad, or what ought not to be the case. So if we know facts about what leads to the worst possible misery, we know what we ought not to do. There is no further defining characteristic of ought in this context than the fact that it is a state you don't want to be. The meaning of the word ought in this context, just as the meaning of the word ought in the context of the game, is whatever fits the rules of the game. The meaning in this context of the word ought, and this is the moral ought, because of course the ought that is being used in the context of playing a game of soccer is not a moral ought. It has nothing immediately to do with morality, unless you assume that breaking the rule is something that is immoral. But in the context of the example that Sam gives, the definition of the word ought in terms of what you want to be the case and don't want to be the case is most foundational. There is no additional fact that is necessary to legitimize. It is a truly valid ought. In other words, you ought not to be in that situation. You ought not to be in the state of the worst possible misery. And this is the most immediate way you can define, the most plausible, in my opinion, way to define the meaning of the word ought. In this context, when you know something about first personal facts, so when you know what will lead to that state, you can immediately deduce what you ought to do and what you ought not to do. And you don't need any kind of further smuggling in, so to say. Peterson accused Sam of smuggling in something into his picture, simply because he didn't see that Sam had introduced consciousness from the very start into his picture. He didn't need to smuggle it in anywhere. It was there from the very start. This is the way I think Sam would frame it, and basically I guess both would agree. But you see what the big mess it gets when everyone uses different terms to designate different meanings. When Sam is arguing against the naturalistic fallacy, Sam is arguing against it because the naturalistic fallacy today is often being used by religious scholars, conventionally religious scholars, to point out that without the Bible, our morals have no foundation and therefore no legitimation. In other words, if there were no God, everything would be permitted. You couldn't define the notion of good without the notion of God. Sam is arguing against this line of thought and showing that the notion of good is perfectly definable if you apply it to the left quadrants, if you apply it to designate a specific state of mind that we're talking about, a specific state of mind that we want to be in. Sustaining that state of mind, fostering that state of mind in other persons is that which is good. And this is perfectly independent of any kind of divine legitimation of the term good. This is the background against which Sam Harris is arguing when he's criticizing the naturalistic fallacy. And we should be reminded that originally Hume used the naturalistic fallacy as an argument against these theological positions that try to deduce an ought from an is, in the sense of the Bible says this and that, and therefore it ought to be the case. This was the original way in which the argument was used by Hume, but it was then turned around, and theologians started to use it against scientists who and wanted to use it to prove that scientists can't tell us anything about ethics. Of course, science in the wide sense that Sam is using it can tell us everything about ethics there is to know. Everything we know about what state of minds we want to be in, and what attitudes we want to take towards life. Everything we know we can learn from literature. We can learn by just discussing with each other and just looking at our own consciousness and seeing what proves itself to be the states we want to be in, and what doesn't.